There is a specific kind of patient that stays with me longer than any other, not the ones who ignored their health, not the ones who never exercised, never checked their numbers, never gave their bodies a second thought, the ones who did everything right. I had a patient, 68 years old, retired teacher. She walked every morning. She cooked at home. She read labels. She had been eating what she genuinely believed was a healthy diet for decades. No processed food, no fast food, vegetables every day, lean protein, whole grains. She came to me because her inflammation markers had been climbing steadily for 2 years. Her blood pressure was harder to control than it used to be. Her cardiologist had increased her medication twice in 18 months. No obvious cause, no smoking, no family history of vascular disease that explained it, no dramatic dietary failures. When I sat with her and went through her daily routine in detail, not the overview, the actual detail, I found it, not what she was eating, how she was handling it afterward. The foods she was eating were genuinely nutritious the first time. What was happening to them between the first preparation and the moment they entered her body the second and third time, that was a completely different biological story. I want to tell you what I told her, because the gap between what people believe about reheating food and what is actually happening in the chemistry of that food after 60 is one of the most consistently misunderstood areas of daily health I encounter. And this is the part that I find genuinely important to say clearly at the start. This is not a story about bad food choices. This is a story about what happens to foods that started as good choices, intelligent, considered, health-conscious choices, when they are exposed to a second or third heat cycle in a body that, after 60, processes the results differently than it did before. Today, I am going to walk you through 5 foods, 5 specific common kitchen staples that most people over 60 eat regularly and consider healthy. And I am going to explain, precisely and specifically, what the chemistry does when you reheat them, and why that chemistry carries a different set of consequences in the body after 60 than it did before. Not to alarm you, not to take something else off your plate, to give you what you need to make genuinely informed decisions about something that affects you 3 times a day, every day. Stay with me. Because the third food on this list, the one most people would never consider a risk, the one that appears on every list of healthy eating advice, is the one that produces the most consistent shock when I explain what is actually happening inside it after it has been cooked and cooled. And this is the part most people aren't told. The risk isn't in the food. It is in the chemistry that the food becomes. 2 different things. Understanding that difference is the entire point of this conversation. Before I walk you through the 5 foods, there is one concept I need you to understand. Because without it, everything I describe today will feel like a disconnected list of warnings. With it, each item connects to a single underlying biological reality that changes how you think about all of it. The concept is oxidative burden. Your body, everybody, is in a constant biological negotiation between 2 processes. The first is oxidative stress, the accumulation of unstable molecular fragments called free radicals that damage cells, arterial walls, and DNA. The second is your antioxidant defense system, the enzymes, compounds, and biological mechanisms that neutralize those fragments before they cause lasting harm. When you are young, that defense system runs at full capacity. Your liver detoxifies efficiently. Your antioxidant enzymes are highly active. Your DNA repair mechanisms catch and correct most damage before it accumulates. The negotiation is close to balanced. After 60, the balance shifts. It does not collapse. I want to be clear about that. The system still functions. But the defense side of that negotiation becomes less responsive. Free radicals accumulate faster than they are neutralized. DNA repair misses more. Arterial wall damage compounds more quickly before it is cleared. And here is the critical connection. Several of the chemical processes triggered by reheating common foods, processes that produce specific classes of compounds, introduce oxidative burden at precisely the moment your body is least equipped to handle it. Not catastrophically on any single occasion, incrementally, meal after meal, week after week, in ways that show up eventually in inflammation markers, in arterial stiffness, in numbers that your doctor can measure, but that trace back to a kitchen habit that never felt like a medical decision. That is the foundation. Now, The 5 foods. The first food. And I want to approach this one from a direction that I suspect you have never heard before. Because most people who have heard anything about this food and reheating already know the surface answer. What they don't know is why the surface answer is incomplete, and why the incomplete version leads to a false sense of safety. Fried food. Specifically, anything cooked in refined vegetable oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil. Here is what most people have heard. Reheating fried food is bad because the oil oxidizes. That is correct as far as it goes. Here is what most people have not heard. The oxidation that matters most does not begin when you reheat it. It begins the moment that oil first reaches cooking temperature. The reheating is not creating a new problem. It is compounding an oxidative process that was already in motion from the first heat cycle. Let me explain the chemistry specifically because this matters. Refined vegetable oils are extremely high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, particularly omega-6 fatty acids. These are the least thermally stable fatty acids that exist. When they are heated to cooking temperature, they begin a process called lipid peroxidation. The molecular structure of the fatty acid chain breaks apart. The fragments that result, compounds called aldehydes, particularly 4-hydroxynonenal and melandialdehyde, are among the most reactive oxidative compounds your body will ever encounter. What do aldehydes do inside your body? They are directly toxic to the endothelium. The single-cell inner lining of your arteries that regulates blood flow, produces nitric oxide, and manages vascular tone. Aldehyde exposure triggers an inflammatory cascade in endothelial cells. The cells become damaged. The lining loses its smooth regularity. Immune cells move in to address the damage. Plaque begins to form. This is not a metaphor. This is the histological sequence that leads from a healthy arterial wall to the kind of arterial disease I have spent 2 decades treating surgically. Now, what happens when you reheat that fried food? The lipid peroxidation process continues. The aldehydes that formed in the first heat cycle are still present, and the new heat cycle generates additional rounds of the same chemistry, layering fresh aldehyde exposure on top of what is already there. Each reheating cycle multiplies the oxidative load, not adds to it, multiplies it. After 60, your liver's capacity to conjugate and neutralize aldehyde compounds through glutathione pathways is reduced. The compounds that a younger body cleared efficiently linger in the system longer, making more contact with endothelial tissue, spending more time in proximity to DNA. The practical response is not to eliminate fried food entirely. It is to eliminate the second heat cycle. If fried food is going to be eaten, it should be eaten once, immediately, the first time. Leftover fried food that has been cooked in refined vegetable oil should not go back into any heat source. If cold is acceptable for the food in question, cold is safer than reheated. If warmth is needed, an oven at moderate temperature with no additional oil represents a meaningfully lower oxidative risk than a microwave or a pan with fresh oil. And here is a small but important substitution worth noting. If you are cooking at home with oil, the choice of oil matters as much as the reheating decision. Extra virgin olive oil, genuinely high quality, not blended, contains predominantly monounsaturated oleic acid, which is dramatically more thermally stable than polyunsaturated vegetable oils. It produces far fewer aldehyde compounds at cooking temperatures. It is not a perfect solution, but it is a substantially lower oxidative burden than the refined seed oils that dominate most kitchens. One oil swap, a real reduction in daily oxidative load, starting tonight. And if this kind of conversation, specific, mechanistic, the information that the 15-minute appointment doesn't cover, is something you want more of, I want to ask you now. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. This is exactly what we do here every week. That is the entire point. Hit subscribe, and let's continue. The second food. This is the one where I always pause before I explain it, because there is an almost universal response when I tell patients what I am about to tell you. The response is, "But this is one of the healthiest foods I eat." And that response is completely correct. Raw spinach, kale, Swiss chard, leafy greens are genuinely among the most nutritionally valuable foods available. High in folate, magnesium, potassium, vitamin K, lutein, a range of antioxidant compounds that directly support vascular health. In their raw form, eaten as prepared, they are doing exactly what you believe they are doing. The chemistry changes. And the change is not about the nutrition. It is about a specific molecular transformation that occurs when cooked leafy greens are stored and then reheated, and that most people, including most people who are careful about their health, have never been told about. Here is what actually happens. Raw leafy greens contain naturally occurring compounds called nitrates. In the soil-grown plant, these nitrates are biologically inert. Your body processes them without difficulty. Under the right conditions, which I will describe shortly, they are actually converted to beneficial nitric oxide, the same compound that relaxes arterial walls and supports healthy blood pressure. But when you cook leafy greens and allow them to sit at room temperature or even refrigerated, the chemistry begins to shift. Bacteria that survive the cooking process, combined with enzymes within the plant tissue itself, begin converting nitrates into nitrites. This conversion is accelerated at room temperature and continues more slowly, even under refrigeration. Nitrites, in moderate amounts, are not a serious problem in isolation. Your body handles them. The problem comes when you apply heat a second time. When reheated, nitrites encounter the proteins in the food and undergo a chemical reaction that produces compounds called nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as probable human carcinogens, with documented associations to cancers of the stomach, esophagus, and colorectum. That classification is not speculative. It is based on decades of epidemiological and experimental evidence. But there is a second consequence that receives even less attention than the cancer association. Nitrosamines are also potent endothelial toxins. They trigger the same inflammatory cascade in arterial lining cells that aldehydes produce through a different mechanism. Endothelial dysfunction, the loss of the arterial wall's ability to regulate tone and produce nitric oxide, is a direct consequence of repeated nitrosamine exposure, which means that the reheated spinach on your plate is simultaneously introducing both cancer-associated compounds and vascular inflammatory compounds into a body that, after 60, has a reduced capacity to neutralize either. This is where many people make the wrong choice. They eat their leafy greens, feel virtuous, because the intention is completely right, and they reheat the leftovers because it seems wasteful not to. The intention was right. The chemistry of what happened between the cooking and the reheating changed what the food became. The practical response is specific and simple. Cook only the quantity of leafy greens you will eat in that sitting. Leftovers do not go back into the heat under any circumstances. If you have more cooked greens than you could eat in the first preparation, refrigerate them immediately and eat them cold. Incorporated into a salad, mixed into a grain bowl, eaten directly from the refrigerator. Cold-cooked greens, while not identical to raw, do not produce the nitrosamine formation that the reheating cycle triggers. One rule: cook what you eat. What you don't eat goes cold, not back into the microwave. The third food. And I told you at the start, this one would be the one that surprises people most: rice. I want to acknowledge something before I explain this. When I describe the risk associated with reheated rice, the first response is usually some version of, billions of people eat rice every day. Entire cultures have eaten reheated rice for generations. How can this possibly be a significant risk? That is a completely legitimate question. And the answer is not that rice is uniquely dangerous or that traditional food cultures have been systematically harming themselves for centuries. The answer is more specific than that. And when it is understood specifically, it becomes genuinely actionable. Here is what the chemistry actually is. When rice is cooked, the vast majority of bacteria in and on it are killed by the heat. But there is one organism, Bacillus cereus, that plays by different rules. Bacillus cereus forms spores, protective casings around its genetic material, that are heat-resistant. Boiling does not destroy these spores. Steaming does not destroy them. They survive the entire cooking process in a dormant state, waiting. As the rice cools, the spores become active. Bacillus cereus begins to multiply. Under favorable conditions, warm ambient temperature, gradual cooling, the nutrient-rich environment of cooked starch, it can double its population roughly every 30 minutes. Now here is the part that most people don't know, and the part that makes the standard advice. Just reheat it thoroughly. Significantly incomplete. As Bacillus cereus multiplies, it produces two categories of toxins: emetic toxins and diarrheal toxins. And these toxins are heat stable. This means that when you reheat rice to a temperature that would kill the bacteria, you are correct that the bacteria die. But the toxins they produced during the hours between cooking and reheating do not. They remain biologically active in the food. You cannot reheat your way to safe rice if the bacteria have already had the time and conditions to produce toxins. The acute consequence, the nausea, cramping, and digestive distress that some people experience after rice that has been handled this way, is unpleasant, but typically self-limiting. What is less discussed is the chronic consequence of repeated low-level exposure to these toxins over time. The gut lining after 60 is different from the gut lining at 30. The intestinal epithelium, the barrier between what you've eaten and your bloodstream, becomes more permeable with age. Compounds that would have remained in the digestive tract in a younger gut cross more readily into systemic circulation in an older one. Repeated exposure to bacterial toxins at levels below the threshold for acute illness still triggers a chronic immune and inflammatory response. Cytokines, inflammatory signaling proteins, are released. They enter the bloodstream. They reach the arterial walls. They contribute to the same endothelial damage and chronic vascular inflammation that we have been discussing throughout this conversation. The gut cardiovascular connection is one of the most significant and most underexplained relationships in medicine. What happens in the intestinal environment does not stay in the intestinal environment. It travels. And in a body over 60, with a more permeable gut barrier and a less efficient systemic inflammatory clearance, it travels further and stays longer. The solution for rice is not to stop eating it. It is to manage the cooling and storage window precisely. Rice should reach the refrigerator within 1 hour of cooking, not 2 hours. Not after the family has finished dinner and the pot has been sitting on the stove for 3 hours while everyone watched television. 1 hour. At that temperature and in that time frame, the Bacillus cereus population has not had adequate time or conditions to produce significant toxin levels. Stored properly and reheated once only, to a fully steaming temperature throughout, the risk is substantially reduced. Not eliminated, but substantially reduced. The highest risk pattern is rice that sits at room temperature for several hours after cooking, then goes into the refrigerator, then is reheated the next day. That pattern has given the organism every favorable condition it needs. 1 hour. Refrigerator. Reheat once. Those 3 rules address the mechanism entirely. I want to pause here for a moment, because I realize that 3 foods in, this conversation carries a certain weight. And I want to be direct with you about something that I mean completely. I am not here to make your kitchen feel dangerous. I am not here to add anxiety to decisions that are already complicated enough. Every single thing I have described so far is preventable. Completely preventable. With changes that cost nothing, require no specialty knowledge, and take no additional time once they become habit. What I am saying is that the gap between a health-conscious choice and a genuinely health-protective choice is sometimes in a detail that nobody ever explained, and the detail matters differently after 60 than it did before. You deserve to know the detail. That is the only reason this conversation exists. If this channel is giving you tools you did not have before, subscribe right now. Before the next food comes up, before you close this video and this information fades. We do this every week. Every week there is something here that the appointment didn't cover. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. Let's keep going. The 4th food, chicken. And I want to approach this one from the angle that matters most, because the surface level advice, don't microwave chicken, is widely repeated and widely ignored, usually because the reason behind it is never properly explained. Let me explain the reason specifically. Microwaves heat food by exciting water molecules throughout the food mass using electromagnetic radiation. The heating pattern is not uniform. It is irregular, determined by the geometry of the food, the distribution of moisture within it, and the specific resonance characteristics of the microwave. This creates what food scientists call cold zones. areas within the food that receive significantly less heat than the surface or high moisture zones. You cannot see cold zones. You cannot feel them from the outside of the food. The exterior of a reheated chicken breast can be hot enough to steam and still contain internal zones that never exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, well below the temperature required to eliminate the pathogens of primary concern. Those pathogens are Salmonella, Campylobacter, and Listeria monocytogenes. Campylobacter is particularly relevant here because it demonstrates thermal resistance characteristics that most people are unaware of. It survives temperatures that kill most other common bacterial pathogens. In food that is unevenly heated, Campylobacter in a cold zone has a meaningful survival advantage, even when the external temperature of the food appears safe. Listeria monocytogenes is the one I want to address specifically in the context of people over 60, because the risk profile is genuinely different in this age group. In a younger adult with a fully functional immune system, a Listeria exposure from reheated chicken typically produces a gastrointestinal illness, unpleasant, potentially requiring medical attention, but the immune response is adequate to contain it. In a person over 60, particularly anyone with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or any degree of immunosenescence, the natural age-related reduction in immune efficiency, Listeria can become systemic. It can cross from the gut into the bloodstream. It can reach the heart valves. It can cause endocarditis, infection of the cardiac lining. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a documented complication in the elderly immunocompromised population, and it carries a mortality rate that no one who has seen it would describe as acceptable for a reheated dinner. This is not said to frighten you. It is said to explain why the advice about chicken and microwaves is not overcautious. It is specifically calibrated to a biological reality of the post-60 immune system that most reheating guidance never stops to explain. The practical response is straightforward. The microwave is the worst option for chicken. An oven, with the chicken covered in foil at a moderate temperature, one that maintains consistent heat throughout the food mass, eliminates the cold zone problem that the microwave creates. Alternatively, eating cold cooked chicken in a salad, sliced over vegetables, eliminates the reheating risk entirely. If circumstances require microwave use, cut the chicken into small, uniform pieces before heating. Smaller pieces with less internal distance reduce the likelihood of cold zones, and allow it to rest for 2 full minutes after the microwave stops. Residual heat continues to distribute during that window and meaningfully reduces the temperature differential between surface and interior zones. Small change, real risk reduction. Started today. The 5th food. And this is the one where I want you to hold 2 separate mechanisms in mind simultaneously, because this food does something that none of the others do. It presents a dual threat. 2 entirely different chemical processes happening in the same food, in the same reheating cycle, producing 2 different categories of risk at once. Potatoes. The first mechanism is one you may have encountered before, but likely without the full context. When starchy foods are cooked at high temperatures, roasted, baked, fried, a chemical reaction occurs between a sugar called glucose and an amino acid called asparagine. The product of this reaction is acrylamide. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies acrylamide as a probable human carcinogen, with associations documented in laboratory and epidemiological studies to kidney cancer and potentially others. Acrylamide forms during the first cooking of a potato at high temperature. This is important to understand. The exposure begins at the first cooking cycle, not the second. But here is the element of the acrylamide story that reheating adds, and that most people have never heard. Each subsequent heat cycle applied to the potato generates additional acrylamide formation on top of what was already present from the first cooking. The exposure is not reset by reheating. It is compounded. The second heat cycle adds to the first. A third adds to the second. The cumulative acrylamide exposure from a repeatedly reheated potato is not simply twice the exposure of a fresh one. It is a progressively increasing load, determined by how many heat cycles have been applied. After 60, the enzymatic pathways responsible for acrylamide detoxification, primarily through glutathione conjugation in the liver, operate with reduced efficiency. The same exposure that a younger body processed and cleared with relative ease represents a higher net burden in a body whose clearance capacity has declined. The second mechanism is the one involving insulin response, and it connects directly to cardiovascular risk in a way that is less obviously connected to potatoes, but is, in my view, equally important to understand. When a potato is cooked and then allowed to cool fully, a portion of its starch undergoes a structural transformation called retrogradation. The starch molecules rearrange into a form called resistant starch, a form that behaves more like dietary fiber than like simple starch. It passes through the small intestine without being rapidly digested. Blood glucose rises slowly and gradually rather than sharply. Insulin response is blunted. The vascular consequences of the insulin spike, the vasoconstriction, the oxidative stress at the arterial wall, the acceleration of arterial stiffening in people with any degree of insulin resistance are minimized. When you reheat that cooled potato, the resistant starch converts back into regular digestible starch. The protective transformation reverses. Blood glucose rises rapidly. Insulin spikes sharply. For someone over 60 with any degree of insulin resistance, and the prevalence of insulin resistance in this age group is substantial, that repeated sharp insulin surge is not a neutral event. It is a direct contributor to the oxidative stress at arterial walls that we have been discussing throughout this entire conversation. One reheated potato, acrylamide accumulation on top of previous exposure, and a sharp insulin spike in a body that handles sharp insulin spikes less well than it did 30 years ago. Two separate mechanisms, both pointing in the same direction. The practical response, and this is the one I find most elegant because it turns a dietary inconvenience into a genuine metabolic advantage. Eat potatoes cold. Cold potato salad, prepared with extra virgin olive oil, a small amount of vinegar or lemon juice, and whatever herbs appeal to you, preserves the resistant starch structure. Blood sugar rises slowly. Insulin response is blunted. The acrylamide that formed in the first cooking cycle is not compounded by a second, and olive oil and the acidity of vinegar or lemon have their own anti-inflammatory effects on the vascular environment we have been working to protect throughout this conversation. A cold potato salad is not a compromise. It is metabolically superior to a reheated potato by every measure that matters for cardiovascular health after 60. This is where many people make the wrong choice simply because they have never been told that eating the potato cold is the better option. They reheat because warm food feels like the natural thing to do. But the natural temperature preference is costing something real. Now let me bring everything together, because I am aware that 5 foods, described mechanistically in depth, can start to feel like a growing list of things to worry about. And I want to close by reframing the entire conversation in the way that I genuinely believe it deserves to be framed. What I have described today is not 5 separate problems. It is one problem expressed 5 different ways: chronic low-grade oxidative burden, the accumulation of reactive compounds and inflammatory signals that the body over 60 neutralizes less efficiently than it once did, is the common thread running through every item on this list. Aldehydes from reheated oils, nitrosamines from reheated leafy greens, bacterial toxins from improperly handled rice, bacterial pathogens from unevenly reheated chicken, acrylamide compounds, and insulin-driven oxidative stress from reheated potatoes. Each one introduces a different class of compounds. Each one feeds the same underlying fire. And here is the element of this that I find genuinely remarkable after 20 years of surgical practice and everything I have read and seen in preventive medicine. Chronic inflammation is not a fixed trajectory. It is reversible. The endothelium, that single-cell lining of the arterial wall that sits at the center of almost every cardiovascular risk we have discussed today, has genuine regenerative capacity when the inputs that were damaging it are removed. The patients I have seen improve most consistently in inflammatory markers, in blood pressure control, in arterial function, were not always the ones who made dramatic dietary overhauls. They were often the ones who identified 2 or 3 specific high-frequency habits and changed them permanently, without drama, without suffering. The changes I am describing today are precisely that kind of change. Oil change. When the current bottle of refined vegetable oil runs out, it is replaced with extra virgin olive oil. One transaction at a grocery store, one fewer source of aldehyde production in the kitchen. Done. Leafy greens. Cook what you eat in one sitting. What remains goes into the refrigerator cold. If it will be eaten later, it is eaten cold. One rule. Applied consistently. Rice. Into the refrigerator within 1 hour of cooking. Reheated once, to steaming throughout. Never twice. One timing habit. Applied every time. Chicken. Out of the microwave. Into the oven, covered, at moderate temperature. Or eaten cold. One appliance substitution, applied to one specific food. Potatoes. Eaten cold where possible. If warmth is required, cooked fresh at low heat for the shortest time necessary. If a cold potato salad dressed with olive oil and herbs sounds like a reasonable meal, that is the metabolically correct choice. The data supports it completely. 5 changes, all of them small. None of them requiring sacrifice of the foods themselves. Only a change in how those foods are handled after they have been cooked. Stacked together, maintained consistently over weeks and months, these changes reduce the daily oxidative burden entering your body through the most frequent possible route. 3 meals a day, every day. The cumulative effect on inflammatory markers, on vascular function, on the conditions that determine whether chronic arterial damage accelerates or slows, is real. Documented. Clinically meaningful. You are not a passive recipient of what your body has become over 60 years. You are in a continuous, active negotiation with it. And the most important inputs in that negotiation are not the exotic or the expensive. They are the ordinary, the daily, the things that feel too small to matter until someone explains the mechanism clearly enough that you understand why they do. That is what I want to leave you with today. Before I close, I want to ask you something directly, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments below. Which of these 5 foods surprised you most? Not the one you knew about already. The one that, as I described the mechanism, changed how you will think about what happens in your kitchen. Leave it below. Because in my experience, when someone reads a comment that names the exact thing they recognized in their own routine, something shifts. A pattern that was invisible becomes visible. Invisible patterns can be changed. Now, if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the moment to do it. Before this video ends, before this conversation fades into the background of your day. Because next week, there will be another conversation exactly like this one, and the one after that, and the one after that. This is what this channel exists for, to give you the specific, mechanistic, unfiltered information that the system doesn't make time to explain. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with one person in your life over 60 who reheats food without knowing what is actually happening to the chemistry of it. That share is 30 seconds. It could change something that cannot be changed later. The doctor may give the recommendation, but the kitchen has always been yours. Take care of yourselves, stay curious, and keep asking the hard questions. Every single one of them.